This is Black and White Makes Gray, a memoir of an interracial childhood by Judith Davidson. Chapter 6. The old Victorian rental house was in the flats of northwest Portland, a kind of neighborhood I had never lived in before. This was not the crest, the hill, nor the slope of anything. It was flat. It didn't have curving roads that looped around the edge of sharp hills with spacious tracts of rhododendrons and camellia bushes. It didn't have canyons spanned by scary high bridges like the Vista Street Bridge. Everything was on a grid until it reached the rounded edges of the hills surrounding the flats. For us kids, our major task in the few months we had that summer before school started was to explore the new neighborhood and meet other young people who could teach us the ropes of what it was like to live there. Within days of arriving, we had met a new pack of young people, and soon our street was ringing with the sound of touch football, tag, and prison ball nearly every afternoon. The most distinctive person among this crowd was a beautiful girl named Patrice, who had thick black hair that dangled below her waist. She was 1 year older than my brother Randy. In other words, she was going into the 7th grade that year. Her parents were from the Philippines, but she had been born in the United States. She lived in a carefully manicured home, not a Victorian, but something of a nearby era, which was situated directly across the street from our beaten-up old rental house. When her father was home, his washed, polished, and gleaming black car sat in the driveway outside the side door. Although her front steps were a favorite gathering place for the neighborhood kids, none of us had ever been invited inside. One afternoon found a gang of us sitting on the front steps of Patrice's house, taking a break between prison ball games, when from the inside someone suddenly opened the front door. It was a short, slight, dark-haired man whom I recognized as Patrice's father. "Patrice," he said sharply to his daughter, and to me he seemed to be scowling with barely repressed anger. "Patrice, come in," he commanded, "and the rest of you can go home," he added, dismissing us curtly. She sighed and went into the house as we drifted away. Shortly after that, we watched her follow him out the side door, get into the black car, and then they drove away. It was some hours before they returned, and Patrice was allowed to leave the house again after dinner. She joined our game in the street, and when we grew tired, we reassembled around her front steps. My brother Randy asking her, "Was everything okay?" "Why?" she asked. "Your dad seemed kind of mad." He was," she said matter-of-factly. "You must remember, he's an immigrant. He came here from the Philippines to make a better life, and he's angry your family moved in here." We looked at her, surprised. I turned to Randy and Janet, thinking, what could we have done? "Your father is a Negro." "No, my stepfather is a Negro," Janet corrected her. Patrice shrugged. "Okay, your stepfather's a Negro. My dad wants to move up in society. He thought this was going to be a white neighborhood. Now it's not. You've made it more difficult for him to become a real American." The three of us stared at her in shock. "It's how he thinks," she offered as means of explanation. "It's not how I think." We all returned to our separate homes for the evening, and as I went up to my room, I couldn't stop thinking about her father's logic. It seemed skewed to me. He was Filipino. Was that white? His skin color was almost the same as Mr. Porter's. Why did he think that being around Negroes made you less white? Patrice's father had just added yet another layer to the pile of things I was learning about race. It was a growing pile, and the longer we lived together with Mr. Porter, the more complicated it became. While we kids were making new friends our own age, we also found ourselves meeting friends of Mr. Porter. They would drop by at all hours, it seemed, to check out where he was living and how he was doing, having taken up this relationship with the white woman from Portland Heights. One evening, I came in from playing late at the park across from Chapman Grade School, where I would be attending in the fall. I tossed off my light jacket in the hallway as I scooted toward the back of the house to make a snack. That's when I found a large, dark man claiming a chair in our living room next to where Mr. Porter was sitting. "This here is Slaughter," said Mr. Porter. I nodded a polite hello, then headed for the kitchen. "Who's he?" I asked Mom, who was slicing potatoes into a frying pan on the stove, the oil spitting and hissing as she did so. "Slaughter? He runs the pool hall in 7th Avenue in North Portland." "How does Mr. Porter know him?" "He used to let Evan stay with him. Evan would keep an eye on his house. People give Mr. Slaughter things to sell, and he does a lot of reselling. He trusted Evan. He knew he wouldn't take anything. Evan served as a kind of watchman. That's where Evan learned to play the piano." "What do you mean?" "Evan noticed piano players were always in demand compared to trumpet players. Slaughter had a piano. One summer, he locked himself in Slaughter's house, spent day and night practicing, and 2 months later, he started playing piano jobs." Note to Evan. Evan? I didn't know it then. But Slaughter, as he was called by those who knew him well, and you certainly knew him well, was a significant link to the Black Portland that had existed before urban renewal had destroyed the North Portland Williams Avenue neighborhood where Black businesses had flourished. You and Mom referred to these events, but it wasn't until much later when I read more on my own I really understood that during World War II this area was filled with clubs like the Dude Ranch, the Frat House, the Keystone. Clubs where famous Black musicians heading north or south on the train to other West Coast cities would stop and make a stop in Portland to play. Black workers had money to spend in Black establishments because of work at the Navy yards that had come to the area. Although gambling was outlawed in Portland, it flourished on Williams Avenue, as did whorehouses and other illicit or semi-illicit businesses that white Portland tolerated, as long as they stayed in the Black neighborhood. You didn't tell me this, but I learned from later reading that Slaughter had worked at the Navy shipyards, where he was known to be a union organizer before he started his own place, a pool hall across from the Keystone on Williams Avenue. Slaughter's place had 4 pool tables and a card room in the back. He loved good cigars, which he also sold, and he was known as a kind of lending agency. For musicians, Slaughter's pool hall was known for its incredibly well-stocked jukebox in the basement. His older brother, a jazz musician living in New York City, kept him aware of the newest records by the greatest jazz artists, which he ordered by mail. Change was in the wind, however, for the Black community of Portland. Although World War II had ended, many of the Navy shipyard workers and their families had decided to stay in the Pacific Northwest, and many of them lived in Vanport, a low-lying area between Portland and Vancouver. In 1948, a massive flood destroyed Vanport, killing hundreds of men, women, and children who were unable to evade the swiftly rising waters. Although the Vanport flood was considered an act of nature, other changes coming to the Portland Black community were not. White businessmen were secretly buying up much of the land in and surrounding the Williams Avenue community of Black businesses, often using Black agents with better access to Black community members. Thus, the stage was set by 1960 for raising the Black business community that had existed on Williams Avenue and building the Portland Coliseum in its place, a gigantic arena for large events like circuses, trade shows, and headliners, surrounded by acres of asphalted parking for event goers. Slaughter's pool hall moved to 7th Avenue not too far away. I can remember Mom driving by it and pointing it out. I knew you went there occasionally still to see him, say hello, and catch up on what was happening. It wasn't the same as before, but it was something tied to that world you had known. But for the most part, the old neighborhood was destroyed, and the remaining Black people moved further out into North and Northeast Portland. In the early 1960s, when I was first introduced to North and Northeast Portland, I was seeing the remnants of Black Portland's commercial area. The Black musicians I met were adrift without a community and clubs at which to play. I didn't realize that when I heard you talk about the man, you were referring in part to these events: the Vanport flood, urban renewal, the building of the Coliseum, and the destruction of that neighborhood and its businesses. It would be many years before your creative community would begin to recover and find places to gather and jam again. It was a long time of grief for you and the musicians you knew. Another time, I came home to find a different stranger sitting in the entrance hallway. "This is Dee," said Mr. Porter, introducing me to a very, very tall man. "He's my cousin." "Dee, this is," he said, turning to me, and then stopped and stared at me. The silence began to feel very strange. He's forgotten my name, I thought, feeling myself beginning to blush. "What's your name?" he finally asked me. "Judy," I said with a sense of unreality. How could he possibly forget my name? We were living under the same roof. Didn't he pay attention to things like people's names? Mr. Porter shook his head. "Well, if people were just named with melodies, I would have no problem. I can remember melodies, but words, why do we have to use words as names?" I stared at him in surprise. Dee smiled. He took his cousin's revelations in stride. Again, I went into the kitchen. My mother was there pulling things out of the refrigerator for dinner. "Who's Dee?" I asked. "That's Evan's cousin, Sidney Porter's boy." "Oh, if you think he's tall, you should have seen his father. Sidney Porter was a jazz pianist here in town. He was so tall, the pianos he played had to be set up on cement blocks to make them high enough for him. He played for years at a place called the Chicken Coop in North Portland. The doorway was this awful laughing mouth of a black man that you had to walk in through. Later, he had his own club near Portland State," she said, referring to the college that was located below what had been our big green house on the hill. I hadn't ever heard of a black man owning a business on the west side of Portland. For some reason, Sidney Porter, black man, had been able to maintain a thriving business outside of where most black enterprises were located. Evan's ideas about jazz are very different from those of Sidney. Evan's much more avant-garde, my mother commented sagely, as if I needed clarification. Maybe, I thought, Sidney Porter's club had survived because it skirted the new kinds of jazz. Whatever you could say about Mr. Porter, he didn't skirt the new jazz. From what I could see, he dove in head first. As I headed up the back stairs to my room, I tried to imagine a world in which your name would be a melody. School was almost upon us when I found myself in the piano room where Mr. Porter was practicing on our old spinet piano. Looking at the piano, I wondered if part of my mother's attraction for him was that she owned her own piano, and that where she went, the piano would go. However, at that moment, what I really wanted to ask him about was that weird little Aunt Jemima ragdoll he had perched at the edge of the keyboard by the bass keys. "What's with the doll?" I asked at a pause in his playing. "It's my music fairy." "Isn't it kind of like making fun of black people?" He shrugged. "Mom said Slaughter runs the pool hall on 7th Avenue and you used to live at his house," I said, stretching out the conversation. Yeah, that's what he does now, but before they tore everything down with urban renewal, he ran the room with the jukebox under the Acme Pool Hall on Williams Avenue. He had all the records that were coming out, and everyone who played jazz would stop by there. He was the king of Williams Avenue. Mr. Porter shook his head. That part of Portland where they did the urban renewal is like a dead zone now, I said rather heartlessly. He nodded in agreement. Yep, that's what the man does to us, he said, and then ran some chords up the piano with his large hands. There it was again, the man. I felt like I was outside of the circle when he said it, and I wondered if I would ever be within whatever that circle was that could speak the word the way he did, although I wasn't sure if it was something I should want. The way he and his friends spoke of the man, it felt like a dead weight on their shoulders, as if they were staggering under a load of rocks. When I thought of the naked blocks of North and Northeast Portland, cut off and mowed down by urban renewal, haunted by the ghosts of black people who had lost their homes and businesses, I could see why they felt this way. Black people had built a community, and white Portland had torn it down. People like Mr. Porter and Slaughter, and probably Sidney Porter among others, had wandered away from the wreckage to look for a way forward after their place had been taken away. Can I ask you a question about jazz? Mr. Porter nodded. How do you know what to play? I mean, like when you're improvising. You know the tune. So you memorize everything? You memorize the tune and the chords. If you don't know those, you might have to go to the fake book. He pointed to a 3-inch thick, spiral-bound pile of paper on top of the piano. I pulled it down and opened it. Every page was a different tune, and above the tune at various bars there were notations for chords. A6, D minor 7, C major, and others. When I took music lessons, I had to do the scales and the circle of fifths, and I learned the names of the chords. But I didn't know you could use it like this, I said with surprise. How else would you use it, he asked. I don't know. I just thought it was something that had to do with music lessons. I didn't know it applied to anything. Mr. Porter shook his head. You know what kills me? You can read music quite well. I can't read music that well. If I could read music as well as you can, I could play anything. There would be no limit. I can read music, I said, but I don't seem to be able to hear music. Not like you. Sometime could you show me how you use the melody and the chords this way, I asked him. He nodded with a faint smile. In my parents' divorce arrangements, my mother was the guardian for the 4 of us, but my father retained visiting rights. Approximately once a month, 1 or more of us would visit him in Seattle, and he was allowed to take us on planned vacations in the summer. When we went to visit him in Seattle, we rode the train, which both parents considered safest for young people on their own. In addition, in the first couple of years after the divorce, Janet and Virginia always had to be accompanied by either myself or Randy on those trips north. It was during the summer of 1966 that we began to operate under these new rules as children of divorced parents. I quickly realized that seeing your father once a month was not like living with him. When you live with someone, seeing them every day, you don't have to stop and update them about a week or a month's events at a time. Even in the first months of my parents' separation, huge amounts of potential experience was lost to us, and every month that gap increased exponentially. My father came down to visit us that summer and take us to the beach, bringing with him a new female friend named Louise. When she stepped out of the car in front of our house, I noticed immediately that she was taller than Mom, almost as tall as Dad, and wearing shorts, something you never saw Mom do. Surprisingly, both my mom and Louise, had dyed black hair. When Dad introduced us, I realized she had a very tiny dark mole on the tip of her narrow, pointed nose. It didn't help that my mother greeted her effusively, giving her best rendition of the friendly divorced spouse. "Show them your rooms," Mom urged, as if we were animals on display at a petting zoo. Feeling I had to comply, I led Dad up the stairs while Randy, Janet, and Virginia followed behind. I knew this wasn't a good idea. Dad could really get upset if things weren't organized, and I was sure our present state wouldn't suit his idea of clean. I was right. He took one look at the gigantic red flowers I had painted on my white walls, one with a big red drip I hadn't been able to wipe away, and I could see he was absolutely revolted. In his world, children did not paint on their walls. I almost wondered if Mom had wanted him to see this. The others took him down the hallway, pointing out their bedrooms, and then we all headed downstairs, and I could see he couldn't wait to get out of that house. I was embarrassed and angry. A part of me wanted to yell at him, "If you think it's such a filthy mess, why did you leave us here to deal with it alone? You are the adult. If you don't like it, fix it or leave us alone." But I didn't say it, because that wouldn't have been polite, and I wasn't ready to cross that boundary. Then we threw our bags in his trunk and crawled in the back seat with Dad and Louise in the front. A nurse and now a nursing instructor in Seattle, Louise seemed efficient, professional, and trying to please and get to know us, the children of the man she was dating. At any other time, with any other adult, I would have been pleasant and forthcoming, but now I felt restrained, my loyalties divided. As we drove with them through the Coast Range towards the Pacific Ocean, I watched the dense forest of evergreens pass by and listened to her questions and the answers of myself and my siblings with a second sense, wondering what she really wanted and what was she hearing. I didn't like to be this way, but it was another sign of how wary I was becoming. There were a lot of questions I wanted to ask him about her, but didn't feel I could. We, meaning our family from before, had always loved the beach, making sandcastles with Dad at the wave's edge, trying to beat the incoming water or trying to figure out the mazes he would draw with a stick of wood in the wet sand for us, searching out tide pools with strange sea creatures, or building forts in the piles of driftwood washed up above the line of sand. All of that was still there for us to enjoy, but now it seemed to have also become a part of the world of separation and divorce, spoiling its original innocence in a way. I wondered what my father thought of the world I had fallen into when he left. I didn't know what I should tell him about Mr. Porter or Mom, what they were doing or why. When Dad asked me questions about how I was doing and what Mr. Porter was like, I was afraid to answer, afraid I didn't know the right answer. Did my dad want to know if I was happy or sad? Did he want to know if everything was okay or if he was missed? It was very confusing, and I wondered if it was the same for all children whose parents were divorced, or was it only this hard for children who lived in the racial twilight where my siblings and I now found ourselves. I was also haunted by the question, did my father still think I was a college person, and was he going to help me to go to college? Before, I had been sure he would say yes, but I was afraid to ask him now, not sure of what his answer would be. I wondered if his feelings about me had changed because of his anger about the divorce and his anger at Mom. I was sure he didn't want us to think it mattered to him that Mr. Porter was a black man, but I felt somehow it did matter. I had the feeling the world thought it mattered. I didn't want to know anything had changed, and I feared that by talking about it, I would make it change. So I held on to my fears and tried to pretend like nothing was wrong. When Dad asked me directly, "How are you doing? How are things going?" I made my eyes blank, but turned up my lips in what I hoped would pass for a smile. "I'm fine. Things are going fine." Once on a phone call, he even asked if I called Mr. Porter, Mr. Porter, instead of using his first name. Of course, I answered, surprised at the question. He never corrected me or said, it's probably time you could call him by his first name. He always seemed satisfied with my answers and would move on to the next subject. Maybe, like me, he was also afraid talking about things would make them worse. Thank you to Westford Community Access Television for providing facilities and production support, all of which made this podcast possible.